The smoke was still rising when she came down the hill at 11:22 on a Sunday morning. She was still wearing her church dress, white cotton with a blue collar, bought secondhand from a market in Kumasi 4 years earlier for 6 cedis, washed and ironed the night. Before the way her mother had taught her, collar pressed flat with a towel and the back of a hot spoon. She had her Bible under one arm and her daughter's hand in the other. She was 43 years old. Her name was not yet known outside a radius of 4 kilometers. That would change. She stood at the edge of what had been her maize field. 2.5 acres that she had cleared herself over 7 months, turned by hand with a short-handled hoe and planted in 3 staggered rows the way her grandmother had shown her, so that the yield came in 3 separate waves instead of one overwhelming flood she could not sell fast enough. The soil was black from the burning. The wooden staking posts her brother Emmanuel had cut for her in March were ash. The irrigation channel she had dug along the eastern edge, 1 foot deep and 43 meters long, had been partially filled with earth from the fire's collapse. She stood at the edge and did not scream. She did not drop her Bible or her daughter's hand. She stood still for the length of time it took the last of the smoke to thin against the sky, which was 7 minutes, and then she turned around and walked back up the hill. Her daughter Akasua was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's silence, which is to say she did not ask any questions on the walk back up. She held her mother's hand. She looked once over her shoulder at the black field. She did not look again. There was a man named Kolad Asiadu Mensa who knew about the fire before it was set. Adwoa Ntiamoa Eduk was her full name, though the people on the hill above Ejisu called her Auntie Adwoa, which was the title given to a woman who had become, by virtue of her consistency and her stillness, a kind of anchor for the people around her. She was 5 feet 4 inches, 61 kilograms, with hands that had not stopped working in 22 years. Not since she was 21, and her father's illness had moved her from secondary school directly into the fields. She wore her hair in a tight wrap on working days, uncovered only in church. She had a habit of pressing her thumbnail against the pad of her first finger when she was thinking through a problem, a small private motion that her daughter had already begun to copy without knowing it. She had been farming this land for 9 years. The land she owned, that was the small compound plot behind the house, where she grew tomatoes and pepper and a yam mound that fed them through October. The field down the hill was a leasehold. She had arranged it in 2015 with a man named Alhaji Danjuma, a livestock trader from Tamale who owned 3 parcels of land in the Ejisu district that he had not farmed in 11 years and had no plans to farm. She paid him 400 cedis per year in 2 installments, February and August, and in turn, she had the right to work the land and keep what it produced. They had shaken hands on it. They had not written it down, because Alhaji Danjuma did not do paper, and because Adwoa had believed at 34 that a man's word was the same as a man's word. 9 years later, she understood that this was true in exactly the way it had always been true. A man's word is only as durable as his interests. Alhaji Danjuma's interests had, sometime in the 18 months before the fire, shifted. The maize field sat at the bottom of a slope that was, it turned out, the southern boundary of a parcel of land that a development company had been quietly acquiring for the previous 2 years. The company was called Goldstream Property Holdings. Their registered office was in Accra. Their operational director was Kolad Asiadu Mensa, who was 51 years old and wore his authority the way some men wear expensive watches, not because they need to know the time, but because they need you to know they can afford not to. He had met with Alhaji Danjuma 3 times in the previous 8 months. Adwoa Ntiamoa Eduik was not party to any of these meetings. Her name was not mentioned in any of the documents that changed hands. Her 9 years on the land and her 400 cedis per year arrangement were, in the language of those documents, unregistered informal usage, had no legal standing and no protection, and which could be terminated at any point by the landowner without notice. The fire was not legally required. It was expedient. It removed the last physical evidence of her presence on the land and gave the clearing a head start before the machinery arrived. Adwoa did not go to the police. She had 4 reasons for this, and she listed them to herself quietly that afternoon while Akosua slept, and she sat at the wooden table with a cup of water that had gone cold. The first, the land was not hers on paper. The second, the man who had burned it was connected to people to whom the police were also connected, and in the Ejisu district in 2017, that was a sentence that needed no continuation. The third, she had 312 cedis in the clay pot behind the cooking stand, which was everything she had saved since February, and a legal case would cost more than that before it produced a single page of paperwork. Fourth reason she did not write down or say aloud, but it was the most important one, and it was this. She had been watching what happened to women in this region who confronted men like Kolad Asiadu Mensa, and she had noticed that the confrontation never hurt the man and always has finished the woman. She was not interested in being finished. She was interested in continuing, and then, in time, in being something that could not be burned. She sat at the table until the cup of water was room temperature, and then cold, and then until the light shifted to the particular amber that meant it. It was 5:30 p.m. in late May. Then she went to wake her daughter for dinner. If you are with me in this, stay with me. Because what Adwoa Ntiamoa Eduk did in the 9 years between that Sunday morning and the morning she walked into the Goldstream Property Holdings Board meeting is something that even the people who loved her did not fully understand until it was complete. She replanted in October, not on the same land, that was gone. She had 312 cedis and a half acre of her compound plot that she had been using for the kitchen garden. She cleared the kitchen garden in 2 weekends. She replanted it entirely with early maturing cowpea, which yields in 60 to 70 days and asks less of the soil than maize, and which could be sold dried, which meant it did not perish in the window between harvest and market day. She bought the seed on credit from a woman named Mame Serwa, who ran an agri-supply stall at the Ejisu Junction and had known Adwoa's mother. The credit terms were informal. Pay when you sell, add 10%, no interest after the first repayment. Mami Serwa's stall was where Adwoa learned the first thing she had not known before the fire. She had been a farmer. Now she became a student. Formally, there was no school for this, and she would not have had the time or the fees if there had been. But Mame Serwa stocked not only seeds and fertilizer, but also in a cardboard box under the right-hand trestle, a collection of agricultural extension pamphlets from the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, technical bulletins from the Crops Research Institute in Kumasi, and 3 dog-eared copies of a journal called Rural Enterprise Quarterly that covered cooperative farming structures, micro-lending models, and small business registration. Adwoa read all of it. She read it in the evenings after Akosua was asleep, with the lamp on the table and her thumbnail against her first finger working through the D. Problems she found in every page. What she found over the following 8 months was that the thing that had destroyed her was not the fire. The fire was the instrument. The thing that had destroyed her was the absence of paper. Everything she had built over 9 years, the cleared land, the irrigation channel, the staggered planting system, the market relationships, the reputation for quality and reliability that had taken her 4 seasons to establish, none of it existed anywhere except in the memory of people who had no legal standing to protect it for her. She had built a real thing in an invisible way. When someone with a pen and a notary had decided to make her invisible official, the real thing had disappeared as though it had never been. She registered her compound plot as a smallholder agricultural holding in January 2018. Cost her 85 cedis in registration fees and 2 days of form filling at the district lands office in Kumasi. It was the most important 85 cedis she had ever spent, though she did not know yet the full extent of why. The cowpea sold in March. She repaid Mami Serwa 275 cedis, The seed cost plus 10% and had 190 seeds remaining. She planted again, she sold again. By December 2018, she had 2,400 seeds in the clay pot, which she moved to a savings account at the Rural Community Bank in Ijisu, because the clay pot was not earning interest, and she had read, in the third issue of Rural Enterprise Quarterly, about the compounding arithmetic of small, consistent deposits over long periods, which had struck her with the force of something she should have been taught at age 15, and had not been. The bank teller who opened her account was a young woman named Abena Darko, 23 years old, 3 years out of the University of Cape Coast, with a degree in accounting that had landed her in Ejichu instead of Accra because her mother was ill. Someone needed to be nearby. She and Adwoa talked for 40 minutes the day the account was opened, far longer than the transaction required, about compound interest, about the Rural Savings Cooperative System, about the micro-lending pilot program that the bank had been running for 18 months and that Adwoa had read about in a ministry bulletin. Abena Darko's supervisor came by twice to check whether there was a problem at the window. There was no problem. There was, instead, the beginning of something. Adwoa joined the micro-lending cooperative in February 2019. She borrowed 3,000 cedis at an interest rate of 12% per annum, repayable over 18 months. She used 400 cedis to lease a half-acre plot from a widow named Ya Asantewa Owusu, no relation to the Queen. The widow always said with a dry precision that Adwoa came to love. At the edge of the Ejisu Road, with a formal lease agreement drawn up by a junior solicitor named Mr. Osi, at a cost of 150 cedis, including 2 copies. She used 800 cedis on certified seed and a small hand pump irrigation kit. She kept 800 cedis as operating reserve, which the Rural Enterprise Quarterly had described as the single most commonly neglected element of small agricultural enterprise, the absence of which caused more failures than weather and pests combined. She planted maize again. She planted it on her own leased land, with her name on the paper, and she pressed her thumbnail against her first finger each morning when she walked the rows, from anxiety now, but from habit, from the private ritual of a woman counting what she had built and what she still needed to build. Akosua turned 10 in 2021 and was already reading her mother's Enterprise quarterly journals in the evenings. She read them the way her mother read them, slowly, with a pencil, underlining things she wanted to understand. When Adwoa found the journals with her daughter's pencil marks in the margins, she did not say anything. She set the journal back on the table with a new pencil beside it. By the end of 2021, Adwoa had repaid the microloan in full, registered a trading name, and Tiamoa Agri Supplies named for her grandmother, and was supplying dried cowpea and maize to 4 wholesale buyers in Kumasi, including 1 institutional buyer. That was a school feeding program covering 12 primary schools in the Ashanti region. The school feeding contract was worth 38,400 cedis per year, paid in quarterly installments. It was the kind of number she had once associated only with men in offices. She did not celebrate. She opened a business account at the rural bank, transferred the operating funds, and asked Abena Darko, who had been promoted twice in 3 years and was now branch supervisor, whether the bank, a commercial lending product for small enterprises seeking to expand. It did. The terms required 2 years of audited accounts, registered business entity, and collateral or a guarantor. She had all 3 or close enough. The collateral was the compound plot she had registered in 2018, now formally appraised. The audited accounts she had been keeping herself, double entry in a ledger she had bought from a stationery shop in Kumasi, checked against the bank statements each month. She had read about double entry bookkeeping in the same Rural Enterprise Quarterly box under Mame Serwa's trestle, in an article that had been written for readers with no accounting training. Taken her 2 readings and 1 session with Abena Darko to understand it fully. In March 2022, she borrowed 40,000 cedis. She used it to lease a second plot hire 2 part-time farmhands, and purchase a second-hand vehicle. A faded red 2009 Kia pickup with 287 kilometers on the dashboard and a tendency to run hot on long gradients, which her brother Emmanuel diagnosed as a thermostat issue and fixed for the cost of the part. The vehicle meant she could move product herself rather than paying a transporter and absorbing the margin compression. It also meant she could attend the Agricultural Trade Fair in Accra in May 2022, where she met a man named Tobena Okafor, who ran a regional aggregation business and who had been looking, he said over a cup of tea at the fair's networking lunch, for a reliable smallholder partner in the Ashanti region who could commit to volume and consistency. She did. She repaid the 40,000 CD loan 14 months early. The bank's regional director, a man named Mr. Kwabena Achiampong, called her into a meeting in October 2023 to discuss a larger facility. He was 58 years old and had been in rural agricultural lending for 27 years and had the careful, deliberate speech of a man who had seen many borrowers and had learned not to assume which ones would survive. He asked her questions for 40 minutes. He listened to the answers without interrupting. At the end, he said, "You understand your numbers." She said that she had learned that the numbers were the story, and if you could not tell your own story, you were always dependent on someone else to tell it for you. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "How much do you need?" she told him. In January 2024, Tiamoa Agri Supplies became Tiamoa Agricultural Holdings. The company employed 7 people full-time and 11 seasonally. It held leases on 4 parcels of land in the Ijisu and Asante Akim districts totaling 19 acres, supplied 4 institutional buyers, and held a framework agreement with a Accra-based export consolidator for dried legumes into the European. Its bank was the Ashanti Rural Development Bank, whose Ejisu branch supervisor was Abena Darko, 29 years old, and due to be appointed to the regional office in Kumasi by the following April. It was Abena Darko who came to Adwoa's office in February 2024 with a news item on her phone and set it on the desk without speaking. The item was a press release from the Ghana Stock Exchange. Goldstream Property Holdings, it announced, was seeking a strategic investor to acquire a 34% equity stake in the company, following a liquidity event caused by the collapse of its primary lender, a Kumasi-based commercial bank that had been placed in receivership by the Bank of Ghana in December 2023. Primary lender was listed by name. It was not the Ashanti Rural Development Bank. Adwoa read the press release once. She set the phone on the desk. She pressed her thumbnail against her first finger. She said, "Who is their legal counsel?" Abena looked at her. "Woa," she said. "I am not going to do anything wrong. I want to know who to call." She did not acquire the 34% stake. That is not what happened, and it matters that it is told correctly. What happened was that the Goldstream Property Holdings distress sale attracted 3 bidders, of whom one was a Accra Investment Group with no agricultural interest, one was a Ghanaian diaspora property fund, one was a consortium that included Tiamoa Agricultural Holdings as a minority partner alongside 2 other Ashanti region businesses that Adwoa introduced to each other at the trade fair in 2022, and that had been building a relationship since. The consortium acquired 51% of Goldstream, which gave it board control. The consortium appointed 3 of the 5 board members. One of the 3 was Adwoa Ntiamoa Eduke. Kolad Ashidu Mensah was still the operational director of Goldstream at the time of the acquisition. He was present at the board meeting in March 2024, at which the new members were introduced. When Adwoa walked into the room, he did not recognize her. She was wearing a dark green dress with a fitted jacket, her hair uncovered. Posture. The posture of a woman who had been carrying weight for a long time and had arrived at a position where the weight had distributed itself correctly. He looked at the name on the board agenda. He looked at her face. He went still. She did not look at him with satisfaction or with anger. She looked at him the way she had looked at the burned field on the morning she had come down the hill, for the exact length of time required to fully understand what she was seeing, and then she looked at the agenda. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. The new board voted to commission an independent review of Goldstream's land acquisition practices from 2014 through 2022, covering documentation, consent, and compensation procedures. The review was to be conducted by an external firm and submitted to the board within 90 days. Khaled Asiedu Mensa did not vote against it. He did not say anything at all in the final 40 minutes of the meeting. He resigned 3 weeks later by letter. The letter did not mention the burned field or Adwoa or the word Ejisu, cited personal reasons, and thanked the company for its years of engagement. Adwoa received a copy in her inbox at 9:47 on a Thursday morning. She read it once. She printed it out, folded it in half, and put it in the bottom drawer of her desk, which is where she kept things that she needed to hold on to so that she could remember exactly what they had cost. The independent review, submitted in June 2024, identified 11 instances of land acquisition in the Ejisu and Asante Akim districts between 2015 and 2021 in which informal occupants had been displaced without compensation or documentation. Adwoa's compound plot was referenced in the review as a boundary property. The 2.5-acre maize field and the 9 years she had worked it appeared in a footnote as unregistered informal occupancy, historical, no current claim. She read the footnote twice. She pressed her thumbnail against her first finger. Then she called the junior solicitor, Mr. Osi, who had drawn up her first lease agreement in 2019 for 150 cedis, including 2 copies, and who had since opened his own practice in Ejisu, and asked whether there was any pathway to restoring a claim for material loss caused by unlawful displacement from informally occupied agricultural land. He said that the law in this area was imperfect but not empty. He said it would take time. She said, "I know about time." Akosua and Tiamoea turned 18 in November 2024. She sat the WASI examinations in May 2025 and received results in July that qualified her for admission to the University of Ghana Business School's undergraduate program in economics and finance. On the morning the results arrived, Adwoa made jollof rice, the proper kind, with tomato and onion paste cooked down in palm oil for 40 minutes until the oil floated to the surface. Then the rice added and the lid put on tight so the bottom crisped into a crust that pulled away from the pot in one piece, and they ate it together. The wooden table in the compound where Adwoa had sat 9 years earlier, with a cup of cold water and 4 reasons she did not say aloud. Akosua said, "Mama, you never cried, not once, after the fire." Adwoa said, "I cried." Akosua said, "When?" She said, "The first morning you went back to school, Monday. 2 days after." She set her fork down. "I want you to see me cry before you understood that crying was not the end of the plan. It is just part of it." Akosua was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What was the plan?" Adwoa looked at her daughter, who had her eyes and her father's silence and her grandmother's name in the company registration document, and 7 enterprises worth of pencil, marks in the margins of the journals under the bed. She said, "There are things that can be burned. A field is one. A wooden stake, paper lease that was never written. A staggered planting system no one ever saw the diagrams of. These can be burned." The fire found all of it that Sunday morning in May, and took it all, because fire takes what is placed in front of it without distinction. What could not be burned was what Adwoa and Tiamoa Eduk carried inside her hands. Not metaphorically, actually. The knowledge of how to read the land. The arithmetic. The double-entry ledger in a notebook bought from a stationery shop. The thumbnail pressed to the first finger, working through a problem in the dark. The 85 cedis that turned a kitchen garden into a registered holding. The patience to plant cowpea when you wanted to plant something larger, because cowpea was what the land and the money and the season allowed. A real farmer knows the differences between what she wants and what the soil will carry. What the man with the pen and the notary and the machinery could not do, what the fire could not do, was get into her hands and take what she knew. He bought the land. He could not buy the farmer. There are people around you right now who have been displaced by something that had a legal document attached to it, who have watched something they built disappear into someone else's project, someone else's name, someone else's plan. They are replanting. They are sitting at tables with cold water, making lists of what remains. They are walking their daughters to school on Monday mornings, so the daughters do not see the crying. They are doing this because they understand, the way Adwoa understood, that the people who take things always count what they have taken. They do not count what they left behind. What they left behind is always the thing that matters. You cannot burn what a person carries in their hands. You can take the field, cannot take the farmer. Here is the question I want to leave with you. If someone took everything you had built over 9 years and there was no legal path back, would you find a way to start from the 85 sedes? Or would the starting over be the thing that broke you? There is no wrong answer. But I want to read yours. Leave it in the comments. Subscribe for more stories about the people who were counted out and kept counting. About hidden strength and quiet power, the ones who were supposed to disappear and instead showed up in the boardroom. I'll see you in the next one.